Hello. Hello. Hello, good morning. Welcome. Good morning and welcome. I'm Andrew Fraser. I'm chairing this morning's event, and it's very good to see you all. It's a great novelty to be all here in person, and there's a real buzz already, and that's a great thing. And it's just wonderful to be back together again, hopefully not too nervous about who's sitting next to you or whether these sniffles or coughs or anything significant. But we've been through that, and hopefully we're coming out the other side, and maybe that's one of the themes that we'll pick up later on the subject. So, welcome to this event. As I say, I'm Andrew Fraser. I chair the steering group for Obesity Action Scotland, which is nested in this college. It's been here for 7 years. I have colleagues who you'll see either shooing you in or shooing you out, or offering you coffee, or sort of giving you directions, but they're here or hereabouts. And so that's a little bit about us. Welcome to you from wherever you've come, and I think people have come quite a long way in some cases, for this event. Can I do a bit of housekeeping before we move on? Fire, we're not expecting one today, and we're not expecting a fire drill today. But if an alarm goes off, there's some little green running persons, and you follow them, and I'll meet you on the corner of St Vincent Street and Blythswood Street. Don't know which one that is, but we'll see each other on the other side. Smoking. Don't do it here, don't do it outside, just don't. Wi-Fi access. It's complimentary. It's just select RCPSG Event Net. You don't need a password, but you do need to agree to the terms and conditions. Social media. We have anyway, I'll tell you what it is. I think it's on a slide which will appear, but it's #ChildHealth2030. #ChildHealth2030. And there's a capital C, capital H, but I don't know if they matter. So that's that, and please chip in if you want to say anything or if you want to communicate your responses. So that'll do for housekeeping. Just to briefly set the scene, now, childhood obesity is really a bellwether of how we are doing as a nation, how we're doing for the child well-being of the nation, but also what that does for future generations, because overweight children are at high risk of becoming overweight adults. Overweight children have a high risk of not fulfilling their potential in so many ways. They're going to be prone to disease, both mental, physical, but also social. And it comes at a cost, a personal cost, a public cost. increasingly, as we talk about health, public health, health inequalities, be it any of these, obesity, child obesity, is way up there amongst the list of things we really need to grip, because it's sliding, by all accounts, or many accounts, in the wrong direction. Now, there's reasons for that, and so the point this morning of the event is to take stock after 7 years since that target was set for 2030, but take stock after the many headwinds that we've seen blow in our direction to blow us off course, the ambition we have. So that's really what lies behind the need for us to gather together after COVID-19 and with the prospect of the rest of the 20s in hand to grip this issue, what we need to do. So that's by way of a bit of introduction. I hope you have all the papers with you. The agenda, I think, was circulated. There's extra copies if you want them. But we're going to start with an address from the Minister, and we're delighted that the Minister can be here with us today. The Minister of Public Health and Sport is Marie Todd. Now, Marie Todd is an MSP for Caithness, Sutherland and Ross, so the North Coast 500, probably most of the most beautiful places in the world. So it must be a great privilege to come from there. I certainly would like to be from there if it was possible. So she grew up in the West Highlands, in her constituency, went to Ullapool High School, became a pharmacist, education in Strathclyde and Robert Gordon's, and also Bedfordshire. She worked for 20 years in the NHS in and around Inverness, also contributed to national work such as the Sign Guideline on perinatal mental health. So we look forward very much to hearing what Marie Todd has to say. Marie will speak for a wee while, and then is willing to take questions because she's got to go away just straight after that. For the following two sessions, we'll gather together the speakers and have the questions at the end of each session. But in the case of the Minister, we'll do it just at the end of her remarks if there's time. So look forward very much to what Ms Todd has got to say. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here talking to you this morning, and thanks Andrew for your introduction and for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be joining this event organised by Obesity Action Scotland because we all share a mission to improve children's well-being. Now, if I'm honest, that mission has never been tougher for us. COVID-19, Brexit, the war in Ukraine, the cost crisis have all presented us with further challenges to be overcome. The income inequality that's associated with the cost crisis has compromised food choices for lots of families, in spite of the significant help that we are offering. In this climate, though, I'm even more determined that we remain focused on improving the well-being of our children and young people. It isn't a choice, it's absolutely a necessity. Now, as you'll be aware, in 2018 we launched our Diet and Healthy Weight Delivery Plan, setting out a bold ambition to improve children's health by halving childhood obesity by 2030 and to significantly reduce diet-related health inequalities. Now, we reaffirmed that aim in September 21, and I'm, again, very honest, I don't underestimate the challenge that we have ahead of us to meet this. According to the latest Scottish Health Survey, that's 2021 data, 18% of children are currently at risk of obesity. That's brought the scale of the challenge that we are facing into even sharper focus. And actions required across all sectors of society to improve health by addressing childhood obesity. Our actions emphasise prevention, in line with our focus on ensuring that children have the best start in life, they eat well and have a healthy weight. Now, in partnership with Obesity Action Scotland, we're supporting pilots of a whole systems approach to diet and healthy weight, focusing on children and reducing health inequalities. I recognise that whole systems approaches are key to improving the preventative impact of public intervention on complex, multifactorial social problems, including through reforming public services. And I want to thank Obesity Action for providing national coordination of that diet and healthy weight pilots and supporting the national evaluation of this work undertaken by Public Health Scotland. The process evaluation, published in December last year, showed that enthusiasm for whole systems working was stronger than ever in the pilot areas, and progress across the national programme stands as a valuable body of learning that can support further whole systems approach work. And I look forward to continuing our partnership with Obesity Action Scotland in the next phase of the work and seeing the development of resources to support national rollout. Now, I know, and I suspect everyone in this room knows, that early childhood is a critical time for establishing good nutrition and healthy eating habits, and that includes protecting and promoting and supporting breastfeeding alongside the introduction of nutritious food at around 6 months of age. I also recognise, and I was previously Minister for Children and Young People, I absolutely get it, that early learning settings and schools have a really important part to play. And I want to ensure that children and young people have access to balanced and nutritious food and drink options throughout their day. Now, we know we can make a difference. In April 21, we introduced revised school and food drink regulations. And according to the Scottish Health data, survey data from later that year, that led to a significant increase in children's fruit and vegetable consumption, rising to 20% of children aged 2 to 15 who consume 5 or more portions of fruit and veg a day, significantly higher than in any of the years 2008 to 2019. Now, all local authorities are expected to meet the standards set out in these regulations. They're flexible enough to allow a wide range of choices to be provided in schools to meet all young people's dietary needs and to account for preferences. And these regulations have been designed to provide children and young people with the appropriate amount of energy and nutrients to support healthy growth and development, reflecting up-to-date scientific evidence and dietary advice. And they'll provide all children and young people with access to their 5 portions of fruit and veg a day on every day that they attend school, as well as reducing the amount of sugar that's available for consumption during the school day. Now, it's really important that we drive forward work that focuses specifically on improving the health and well-being of children. But that's not enough. We need to also take more wide-ranging action, and that's why we're seeking to transform the wider environment that encourages less healthy options. I talk about us living in an obesogenic environment now. We've created almost a perfect storm. It's very hard to live healthily nowadays. Now, not only is that much more likely to improve diet and weight, it can also be more effective in reducing health inequality than only encouraging individual behaviour change. And we know that this can work. We know that the promotion and marketing of unhealthy food and drink in particular can significantly influence the choices that we make both in and out of our home. And often the environment is skewed towards the promotion of less healthy options, encouraging extra spend and higher calorie intake. And that's why we're going to be legislating to restrict less healthy food and drink promotions, making it easier for individuals and for families to make healthier choices. Now, encouraging healthier options isn't all about legislation, it's also about the practical support that we as a government can provide. So we're developing a new Eating Out, Eating Well framework, engaging with stakeholders, including industry and local authorities, to help outlets provide healthier foods to support the achievement of Scottish dietary goals. And that's one of a range of initiatives in development as part of our out-of-home action plan, which also includes consulting on calorie labelling and a code of practice on children's menus. Now, alongside this, our Healthy Living programme has strengthened links in the community between retailers, schools and local people. Now, that programme's Big Breakfast and Healthy Living Day events brings together local convenience shops, schools and the wider community, and it helps to encourage children and adults to buy healthier products. At the event, the retailer, along with the Healthy Living programme team, visit the primary school. They serve the whole school with a sample of a healthy breakfast. The breakfast allows many pupils to sample products they wouldn't normally have access to at home. And I've seen firsthand the work that the Big Breakfast events does for those in its communities. I was invited along to the spa in Bowness in September last year, and while I was there, the school pupils and myself were given a tour of the store, highlighting the healthier products, all at eye level, to encourage people to spot them, shown how to identify what was a healthier product. And the pupils and myself were also given a chance to sample some exotic fruits, some of which I have to admit, I mean, this is my West Highland background, I had never tried before. I had never seen, never mind tried before. I wasn't sure I could identify them. It reminded me of when I used to get a veggie box and I used to have to send pictures to my sister, who's a chef. So what's this and what do I do with it? I know that improving diet is not the only important factor in improving children's health and well-being, and I understand the importance of sport and physical activity and the positive impact that that has on children's physical, mental and social health. In fact, everyone's, not just children's. I'm absolutely committed to supporting Scotland to become a more active nation by encouraging people to make physical activity part of their everyday lives. And our Active Scotland Outcomes framework identifies the importance of developing physical activity and competence from the very earliest age. That's the key component of delivering our vision of a Scotland where people are more active more often. And that's why we've committed to ensuring that Sport Scotland's Active Schools programme is free for all children and young people by the end of this Parliament. Now, prevention is a key aspect of achieving our aim, but we also need to ensure that we've got effective interventions in place for people who need them. And that's why we continue to fund NHS boards to deliver weight management services for children and young people in line with national standards. We've provided £2.3 million to health boards this financial year to deliver those services, and that's an increase of £0.3 million on last year's core investment of £2 million. We've also confirmed to health boards that funding for weight management services will continue for at least the duration of this Parliament until 26-27. Now, as well as this core funding, we've provided almost £600,000 this financial year to 6 health boards and their partners to continue projects to encourage healthy eating and good nutrition in families and communities who are at risk of diet-related health inequalities. And that work includes specialised training for practitioners, increasing physical activity and support for people who are experiencing food insecurity. And I want to thank NHS boards and their local partners for this really important work. Improving health and reducing health inequalities across Scotland is a clear priority for this Scottish Government. We know that people living in poverty have poorer health outcomes. Improving diet and healthy weight and the actions I have outlined are really important in changing that, but dealing only with the consequences of poor diet and higher weight isn't enough. There are a range of underlying causes that contribute to childhood obesity, and we absolutely need to address these. And that includes ending poverty, supporting fair wages and families, improving our physical and social environments. So I've covered a lot of different examples of work that we're taking forward to improve children's health by improving diet and weight. It's impossible to cover everything in the time that's available, but what they all have in common is that commitment to the children of Scotland, and I absolutely know that all of you in this room share that commitment with us. So in closing, I ask you to consider further opportunities to collaborate, to support the health and well-being of children, and think and consider how you can continue to improve and encourage other people to do that likewise. And thank you very much for having me along. I'm hoping I'm going to get an army of helpers out of this, so thank you very much for coming along, and I'm happy to take questions.
Minister, thank you very much indeed for what you've had to say. Lots of encouragement, and it sets out very well the landscape we have and the promises that there are contained within it. Now, questions, comments, could you wait for a microphone to come your way, but just indicate if you'd like to make a contribution now, and we'll come towards you. I'll do some pointing. Any initial ones?
I've answered all the questions, have I? I love that.
There's a lady just on the edge there, and the microphone is coming towards you. Could you identify yourself?
Hi, I'm Louisa Walker from NHS Lothian, and I lead for one of the whole system approach areas. One of the things I was sort of thinking about as you were speaking is we're looking at whole systems approach in one area. One of the comments that's come up is about the amount of fast food joints that are down a high street, and actually the licensing behind that. And what are the moves at a national level to address the licensing around fast food joints and maybe alcohol joints, if we're thinking about sugar levels and bits and pieces? Is there anything that's going to come from above?
So at the moment, we're looking at consultation on guidance for menus for children and things for eating out of home. What's happened over the last few years is a significant change, behavioural change in the whole population and how we eat. So partly because of the pandemic, we're doing a lot more takeaway eating, and that is impacting undoubtedly on our health. I think in general we are going to have to think about licensing. So I think about the food environment. I think about non-communicable diseases as a whole, and I think we've got issues with the quality of food that we eat. We've definitely still got issues with tobacco. We've got issues with alcohol, and we're not moving around enough as a population. Now, the first three, tobacco, alcohol, food environment, the World Health Organization is very clear what I need to do. I need to tackle affordability, availability and attractiveness. And you'll see work going on right across the spectrum in that. It is challenging at this moment in time to take action on business. I mean, I've heard, and all of us will be familiar with the phrase social determinants of health. Over the last few years, as Public Health Minister, I've become very familiar with the term commercial determinants of health. So this idea that we live in an environment where big companies are trying to encourage us to spend money we don't have on products that we don't need, that are actively harmful for us, has definitely landed in government. We get that. The challenge is, how do we change that? And how do we change that at this moment in time? I mean, it's not food and drink, but you'll know at the moment I've got a consultation out about alcohol promotion and advertising. Now, pretty much universally across Scotland, everyone acknowledges that even though we've done good work and we're heading in the right direction, we still are suffering the consequences of a very long-standing, challenging relationship with alcohol. Now, I've put that consultation out. If I read the papers and believed them, I would think I was introducing prohibition. So it's challenging. I do have some sympathy for businesses at the moment, because I think There has been a really difficult time over the pandemic. And also I'm Public Health Minister. I know how important employment and a healthy economy is to the health of the nation. I think at times of food insecurity, it's hard to take action. So when it comes to promotions and bog-offs of food, it's very easy for us to provide data that says actually people are being encouraged to buy things they don't need, that are of low quality to their health, and spending money they don't have. But it seems counterintuitive, and it's politically challenging to say I'm going to make unhealthy foods more expensive or less accessible at this moment in time when people are really struggling to just make sure their children get enough calories in a day. So there's it's a very long-winded answer, but there's a lot of understanding of the challenges that our population faces. There's also the really grim statistics. So we're going to have to take bold action if we're going to turn that around. But it's really, really challenging at this moment in time. And I'm definitely would be up for regulating those takeaway environments. The other thing is, and I'll just share this dilemma with you all, and you can tell me what you think. One of the things that happens when they introduce regulations in the out-of-home sector in England, for example, is that they exempted all those small takeaways that are generally concentrated in areas of poverty. And I am very conscious that if I am tackling the food environment, I can't omit the very environment where the people who are worst off are buying their food. And that's a challenging one to tackle, because often these are very small businesses, and it would be the burden would be disproportionate. So these are the challenges we're facing in government, but we'll get there.
That's quite a tour of the landscape.
Well, I've answered all the questions now. I'll just go home.
We're not done yet. The lady next to Shona.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lauren Carters-White, and I work on the Spectrum Research Consortium, which looks at the commercial determinants of health. And one thing that really strikes me about basically what you've just said there is the food environment, but also the power that the food industry and these other industries have. Mm-hmm. And not only controlling our environments, but potentially being part of the wider policy process and changing in your role. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that as well, because that's fuzzier and more difficult to tackle, but I'm just interested in your perspective on that.
So I would say it is fuzzier and more difficult to tackle. So when it comes to the tobacco industry, there's very clear guidance. World Health Organization have a framework for engaging with tobacco companies, and obviously quite clearly, it's very clear-cut. Public health policy, they should have absolutely nothing to do with. They still get in about everything, and they're still, in the Parliament, chatting to parliamentarians. I had a, face-to-face off with one of my colleagues the other day saying you just should not engage with tobacco companies. There is nothing they can tell you that is helpful to your thinking as a politician. Very clear cut for tobacco. A little bit fuzzier for alcohol. And one of the challenges that we have as a nation with alcohol is that it is also a really important industry to Scotland. So I was working as a health professional when I was working as a mental health pharmacist back when they were introducing minimum unit pricing of alcohol. And myself and my colleagues in the psychiatric hospital that I worked in all looked at that policy and thought, it's fantastic. It's evidence-based, it's targeted, and it'll work. It'll make a difference. And I've said, since I became a politician, I've said directly to the Scottish Whisky Association, myself and my colleagues were absolutely, utterly horrified at the way that you took that piece of legislation to court, challenged it, and delayed its introduction for many years. And I was saying this, the name itself, challenging, Scottish Whisky Association. And, I know that all of the distilleries that are employing people in my constituency, I know the impact they have in our communities. But I know that they're owned by global peddlers of cheap vodka. So it's not that sort of mythical status. craft industry that would like that we could believe if we believed the portrayal. So that's challenging. I think when it comes to the food environment, it's also challenging. It's not at all clear cut. And the difference with food is that everybody needs to eat it. So with smoking, absolute abstinence. There's nothing, no controversy. Alcohol, actually the medical evidence would say there's no safe dose, and there's much more evidence suggesting that we need to really lower our healthy levels of drinking, and acknowledgement of that fact that people aren't drinking healthily in Scotland, even in the normal population who aren't drinking hazardously. But food, the challenge is we've all got to eat. So you can't take an abstinence approach. We somehow have to get people to eat healthily. And these industries are really powerful. I mean, I think it was Kellogg's that took the UK government to court and actually lost. So there's a good sign. But there's lots of, I mean, it's not that we're afraid of litigation. It's just, well, look at what happened with minimum unit pricing. It takes a long time to go through the process and to introduce, and to, you know, I often think about how many people died each year while we were waiting to introduce that policy, and how much slower we are at gathering the data that shows how effective or not it is. And is it maybe less effective than we hoped because the minimum unit price was set back in 2011 and it wasn't introduced till 2018, and we're assessing it now in 2023. So it is, you can't ignore the impact that they have. And you know, you've got to work with them. It would be good if we could, you know, if we could get some consensus around the food environment being part of the problem. I'm not sure culturally we're not very keen on that concept in the UK. And I often talk about, like I had a conversation many years ago with a Northern European pal who was saying, you know, I don't understand why you guys are so hung up about the nanny state. You know, we quite like the idea of our government taking care of us. And I just thought it's such a stark contrast, whereas in the UK we're very focused on individual choices, even though we know that between poverty and advertising and limited options, it's quite hard for lots and lots of people to make healthy choices. But we're quite hung up on that culture, and we need to take the people with us, and it would be better if we could avoid years of litigation after introducing policies that were effectively targeting that area. So difficult, tricky to navigate. Easier with tobacco.
And maybe this is our last or penultimate question. So
that's because I can talk for Scotland. Sorry. I really admire poets because they're so succinct.
Hi, Marie. Thank you for your address. It was really worthwhile. Linda Morris here, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. I'm really pleased, you know, about the establishing healthy eating patterns in the early years, and I think that focus is, you know, nobody's going to argue with it. I guess this is just a plea for the importance of adolescence as well, though, because I do think sometimes it gets lost, and for quite a lot of reasons, and it's dear to me because I have a particular programme that looks at adolescence, but there's never really a big focus on that, but actually it's a really important stage. One, because it becomes the reliable predictor for adult overweight and obesity. You know, that you have adolescents having more autonomy with their diet. You know, they get to that stage where the uptake of school meals is getting lower and lower. They're dropping their levels of physical activity. That's dropping off. The social influencing is getting stronger. And actually, you know, some of them are progressing into adulthood, as I say, with really bad eating patterns. And of course, when we now have pharmaceutical remedies on the market and a lot of publicity around being able to go out and buy under licence Wegovy and inject it as a solution to the problem, it really isn't, because we haven't done our job of establishing. So it's about, I think, about having that life course approach, and a plea that we don't miss out in adolescence. That we forget about it in favour of early years, because by the time they get to secondary school, some of those behaviours have changed, and they are, they're agents of their own destiny, basically.
So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think about the early years, the under fives, as being, it's where you get the biggest bang for your buck, frankly. And that's because when you get things right, you get a prize that lasts a lifetime. It's also that if things go wrong, it often lasts a lifetime. But adolescence, when I'm thinking about the pandemic, and particularly when it comes to physical activity levels, actually, there are two groups in our population that I am particularly concerned about. One is frail elderly people, because just losing a tiny bit of physical activity is enough to put them at big risk of falls, and the burden that that will put on our NHS is enormous. But adolescents, and I can see it in my own family, they literally stayed indoors and didn't move an inch for years, and comfort eat, as many of us did throughout the pandemic. And it's a really bad time of your life to get into bad habits. And I think all of the things that you mentioned, like that autonomy, the peer pressure, I would also say there's some evidence that children and adolescents are more susceptible to advertising. So that, if we think again about that food environment that we're creating, it's probably very important to try to reduce that level of exposure. There's also the fact that they are exposed, because of the way we consume media nowadays. My children certainly live in a completely different world to me. They see totally different adverts to the ones I see, and they're, the things they are attracted to and enticed to are very different from the things that are targeted at me. So it's a difficult one to tackle, but you're absolutely right. We need to pay attention. Yeah, come back, tell me how to fix it.
You mentioned bang for buck there, and I worked with a colleague for years, Professor Charlotte Wright, who always said you need a lot of bucks to get that bang in early years because you're targeting the whole universal population. But in actual fact, you can target your bucks at a specific population. For a bigger bang in the adolescents, but of course we've lost the primary 6-7 BMI, so we don't have any way of knowing how bad the problem is, if you know what we think.
I know, and that takes us into a whole other conversation about monitoring the weight of the population, and how can you tackle this issue if you don't have the data? But how do you gather the data without stigmatising? And of course there's lots of political attention on all of the measuring that we do in schools nowadays. So, yeah, you're right, losing those couple of years of data is difficult. They've definitely stopped moving as well, though. And I know personally that you can't outrun a bad diet, but never, that physical inactivity is as dangerous. When I'm thinking about non-communicable disease, I'm thinking about smoking, drinking, eating, and moving. We have got to get the whole population moving more. We are luckily, it's not lucky actually, we've got a massive programme of work going on that, and we've got policies that are actually making a difference. So we're bucking the global trend in how much we're moving in Scotland. But there are certain pockets of our population that aren't moving at all. And I'm astonished at how still my teenage children are. I can't quite believe they managed to spend quite so much time quite so still.
Thank you.
No bother.
Thank you. I'm afraid time moves on, and we're very grateful to the Minister for coming to speak to us. Can I just quote a couple of things back at you, which was one, at the very start you said, we're on a tough mission. And right at the end, you said you're looking for an army of helpers. And I suppose the question, not so much for you, if you'd like to answer it, fine, but for the rest of us, for the rest of the morning, is what help can we give on this mission where we've been blown off course and we need to get back on? So I would ask you if you have any guiding principles, but also I think ask the audience about how we would like to end the morning, knowing where we are and knowing where we want to be. What help can we give as your army?
So I think bold ideas for definite. Think big. Don't think about where we currently are. Think about where we want to be and how we can get there. Things like you can target the bucks and get a bigger bang. That's very helpful information. In government, money is really tight just now. There's just no getting away from it. So guidance on how to spend that money where it will have the biggest impact is really helpful at the moment. That's not to say that we want to take money away from under fives, but we want to know that sort of information. I also feel that we need to get some quick wins in. I feel that people are feeling a bit... I mean, I had a meeting with my UK counterpart a couple of weeks ago, and it was almost as if it was inevitable that our entire nation was going to become... And he was saying, you know, globally, this is the trend, as if government can do nothing about it. And I just think those quick bangs to remind us that there are things that we can do about it that will be successful, that will make an impact. I think the quick things as well, because I mean, we've only had, I really fear the impact of the pandemic in this area. And I think it's only a few years that put things really awry. It shouldn't be so hard to quickly turn them around. You know, it's not a lifetime trajectory. It was an abnormal few years in people's lives. And we need to find quick and easy ways for them to get back to healthy living. And I'm very much about making it easy for people to make healthy choices.
Minister, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning and for your contribution. Thank you. Yes. So we're now moving into 2 crisp sessions of an hour long each, 3 contributions and some questions at the end of each of these 3 contributions. First up is my colleague Lorraine Tulloch, Programme Lead for Obesity Action Scotland, who will tell us about data and trends. Now, Lorraine may need no introduction, but I'll give her one anyway. Lorraine has worked with me in Obesity Action Scotland for 7 years, has had a fascinating career starting with environmental health training down in London, doing climate change before we thought about climate change, and then up in Scotland doing place-based public health before we thought about place-based public health, in fact planting some seeds and watering them in the Scottish Government before it was called the Scottish Government. So a leader, sometimes before her time, but usually with it. So Lorraine's going to speak to us to really lay out the ground and look forward to that. Lorraine.
Okay, thank you very much. That made me feel a bit old, Andrew, all those before.
Not as old as me.
Okay, so I'm just going to take a few moments this morning really just to set the context for the 2 great speakers that are following after me, and to expand a little bit on some of the things the Minister said, just to set the scene around some of the data and where we are. So I'm going to a wee bit of reflection on the theme of the conference that's been set for today, how we're progressing in Scotland, and what the data can tell is a bit of a story around that. I'm just going to check that I can work this. Yes, excellent. So the theme of today's event, can we achieve that ambition that the Scottish Government set? Can we actually halve childhood obesity by 2030? So the ambition itself came about as a result of quite a lot of advocacy work by many organisations across the UK, but it was really Jamie Oliver's timely intervention in May 2018 which led to our First Minister making quite a public commitment to halve childhood obesity by 2030. That commitment was then set out in policy documents through the Diet and Healthy Weight Delivery Plan that the Minister's already referred to, and that was published in July of 2018 as well. So that was a really welcome commitment, and it really demonstrated, and we've heard from the Minister how committed she is to pay attention to this aspect of children's health. And we knew it was an ambitious ask when it was set. But to put it in a little bit of context, if we think about the ambition that Amsterdam, who have quite a strong reputation in this field, the ambition that they set was to have all of Amsterdam's children a healthy weight in 2033. So that's even more ambitious than what we've set for ourselves. So if we come back to Scotland, and we're now almost 5 years on, we're at the 5-year anniversary from this ambition being set, how close are we to meeting it? And the Minister referred to this data, but the statistics are not particularly good news. When the ambition itself was set, 2016 was agreed as the baseline year, and that meant that the target prevalence rate we were looking for was 7% by 2030, and that 7% is indicated in that diagram, the purple line. And we've seen how, you can see from this graph, how the rates have changed. Even pre-pandemic, we were seeing a rise, and COVID-19 had an impact, so we've got no data for 2020 because there was no children's data collected. And then 2021, we're seeing that rate at 18%. However, we at Obesity Action Scotland, we're not drawing any firm conclusions from that yet. It was self-reported data on height and weight, and it's, when you look at it compared to some of the primary one measured data, there's a few concerns around it. So we're going to kind of wait and see what the future years bring. But I think what we can see is that we're concerned that we're potentially going in the wrong direction, and we need a real focus on this issue if we're going to turn it round. But what we do have in terms of measured data is our 5-year-olds. We've got our primary one data. And if we look at the stats around primary one, this represents a typical primary one class of 24 children that started school in August 2021. In that class, approximately 6 children are of a higher weight, so are at risk of overweight and obesity. And across Scotland, that equates to 12,500 5-year-olds. 12,500 5-year-olds started school already at a higher weight. And I think that's something that should really concern us all. And it's something that really drives our work at Obesity Action Scotland to make sure we can pursue the policy interventions to change that. And if we think about that data in a bit more detail, what things should we be concerned about? Inequality is a key issue, and again you're going to hear from speakers later about that, and they'll cover it in much more depth than me, so I'm not going to cover this graph in much depth. All I'm going to say is that we've seen the marked socioeconomic inequalities in children's weight, and they've persisted over time. And we can see from this data that primary one children from the most deprived backgrounds are over twice as likely to be at risk of developing obesity compared to the least deprived children. What else if we think about drilling down into that data? Well, if we look at the data in terms of the BMI categories themselves, last year we published a report, Weight of the Nation. There are some copies of it available today for people to pick up. And that was quite an in-depth analysis of data from the Scottish Health Survey for a pre-pandemic period, 2008 to 2018, and it looked across all age groups. But what we can see in this graph, and what I will point out is this graph uses the terminology morbidly obese. That's not terminology that we prefer to use. It's not our preferred terminology, but it is what's in the Scottish Health Survey. So we wanted to be consistent with the data as it's presented, so that's why that terminology is used here. But the really important message from this graph is to look at the section of the data on children who are living with obesity. And we can see that over half of the children that are living with obesity are children who are living with morbid obesity. Again, that's something we really need to stop and think about and see how policy can change that. So it's a challenge. We've outlined a challenging picture of the situation we have with children's healthy weight and achieving that. We'll have a look at policy later on this morning. But what I wanted to touch on here is to try and give a little bit of hope. We've heard from the Minister, we've heard how committed they are, and from this graph, which is some work that was done by Tom Steiner, who's now in our team, but was with us on a placement, and it looks a bit like the work that was done in England that maps the policy against the rates and how they've changed. But I think what we want to show with this graph and with what the Minister said this morning, that there is a recognition of the issue and that there are lots of commitments being made. And I suppose it's our responsibility to try and make sure those commitments are delivered and that other ways of delivering effective interventions are also identified and we can take them forward with the government. So I think we hope that we are starting to see some positive change in terms of the policy landscape, and again we'll focus on that later on. But I think we just have the opportunity at this conference today to really think about the current situation, where we are, and some of the bold and ambitious solutions that we need. And that's all just to ensure that we can create a Scotland where our children grow up a healthy weight And I'm sure that is something that everyone in this room would aspire to achieve. So thank you.
Lorraine, thank you very much indeed. And that sets the scene very nicely for our next contribution from Dr. Anna Pearce, which is entitled, as you see there, Inequalities in Childhood Obesity. Dr. Pearce is a Senior Research Fellow at the MRC CSO Social and Public Health Sciences Unit here in the city. Co-leads a work stream on reducing health inequalities. Anna has authored commissioned reviews of inequalities in child health, including for WHO Europe, and recently led on a Health Foundation commissioned report. I think quite a lot of the material you'll be presenting will be from that report or based on that report about health inequalities in Scotland over the last 20 years. Anna's background is in geography, population studies, demography with health, and child public health, where she studied her PhD. She's worked in University College London, Adelaide, before coming to Glasgow. So thank you very much indeed for speaking with us this morning, and look forward to what you've got to say.
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction and for the invitation to speak today. Apologies, I think I just inadvertently moved that slide on, trying to work out if there's a pointer, but I'll come to that in a moment. Today I'm going to be talking about the unfair differences that we see in obesity risk across children from different socioeconomic backgrounds, so inequalities in health. And so the starting point for this presentation is the report that we published in the autumn, which was commissioned by the Health Foundation. And in that we were describing trends in inequalities and many different health outcomes in Scotland over the past 20 years. So looking at health right across the life course. And so in that report, we highlighted childhood obesity as a concern. And it was something that we chose to focus on in press releases when the report was published. And so what I'm going to talk to you now are 4 points that were underlying these concerns, and also we're starting to move towards thinking about what some of the explanations behind these worrying trends might be. So I'm going to draw on data from that report and also pull in a little bit of evidence from other sources and also a little bit of theory. So our first point was that there are large and widening inequalities in childhood obesity. So Lorraine has already spoke to this very briefly. So in this graph, we are looking at the proportion of children who are at risk of obesity at the start of primary school. And we're looking at how that's changed over time across deprivation levels. So in the darkest blue line at the top, we've got children in the most deprived areas, and in the pale grey line at the bottom, children living in the least deprived fifth of areas in Scotland. So data collection was still getting up and running during the early 2000s, so we can't focus too much on the lack of variation across deprivation that we see in the towards the beginning of this time series. But what's striking is that for the past 10 years or so, the prevalence of obesity risk in children has been going down in the least deprived areas by small amounts, but nevertheless it's going down, whereas in the most deprived areas it's been going up. So we see this if we look to other age groups as well, so using Scottish Health Survey data. We see it if we use different classifications for overweight and obesity. And this isn't something that's just about area level deprivation. There are also really big inequalities in childhood obesity when you look to family income, parental educational qualifications, family circumstances, and so forth. So quick aside, why should we care about these inequalities? Well, they're avoidable, they're unfair, and in Scotland we've committed to giving every child the best start of life, regardless of their socioeconomic background. Inequalities in obesity can track across the life course, affecting your weight as an adult, other aspects of health and your life chances, employment opportunities, and so forth. And these inequalities also pass from one generation to the next. So given all of this, there are actually really high financial and societal costs to these inequalities. So the second point that we make in the report is that these inequalities are unlikely to be explained by physical activity. And that's because when we look at objectively measured physical activity in children, i.e. when we don't just rely on parental reports of participation in sports clubs and dance classes and that sort of thing, there actually aren't any inequalities in physical activity in children. And so this graph here is using data from growing up in Scotland, where kids had their activity levels monitored using accelerometers. And what we're seeing is mean daily minutes spent in moderate to vigorous activity. And children on the far left in the dark blue bar living in most deprived areas are as active and, in fact, a little bit more active than their peers who are from more advantaged backgrounds. And this isn't a quirk of the GUS data. We see this same finding if we looked at other similar data sources, so the UK Millennium Cohort Study, Avon longitudinal study of parents and their children. We see the same things. And we'd previously shown this limited potential for physical activity, albeit in UK-wide data. In terms of tackling inequalities in childhood obesity. That's not to say physical activity isn't important for many different aspects of health, but it's not going to be the solution for tackling inequalities. So in this work, we'd simulated the impacts of hypothetical interventions and policies to increase physical activity, and we found that a universal achievement of national physical activity targets for children could potentially reduce prevalence of overweight to Swedish levels. So at the time of writing, that meant a fall from 27% to 22% in terms of overweight and obesity combined. But what we found is that that achievement of that target, if possible, wouldn't reduce inequalities and in fact might even widen them slightly. In addition to that, we simulated the scale up of physical activity interventions that have been found to be effective in trial settings, and we found that those also, if we scaled them up to the population level, would have minimal impact on prevalence and inequalities of overweight and obesity, even if they were targeted at high-risk groups, and even if they were rolled out in what would probably be unmanageable doses. And what I mean by that is there was one scenario we simulated where families were hypothetically subjected to healthy weight interventions for kids that were already overweight or obese, active commuting schemes, break time interventions, after school sports clubs. It was a whole host of different things, and even that made very little difference. We've also can see from the literature that other early years factors, so things like smoking in pregnancy, infant feeding, play a minimal role in contributing to inequalities in overweight and obesity. So in this graph here, the very top dot is showing us the elevated risk of obesity in children whose mothers had lower compared to higher educational qualifications, so they were 1.7 times more likely to be overweight or obese. And then each subsequent dot just shows what happens to that level of inequality when we take into account things like whether the mother was overweight herself before pregnancy, whether she smoked during pregnancy, birth weight, infant feeding. And so even when we account for all of those things, so if looking to that bottom line, there's still a really large degree of inequality. And this really hits home that there's not one simple solution here. So the third point that we made in the report was that inequalities in diet are probably a bigger concern when it comes to overweight and obesity and inequalities in children. So this graph is showing the proportion of adults who ate less than one portion of fruit and veg in the previous day. And we can see that there are large inequalities and that prevalence of low fruit and veg consumption is going up in the most deprived areas. And of course, behind that is access and affordability of healthy food. So in the report, we highlight these two facts, which are from the Broken Plate report. So calorie for calorie, healthy foods are 3 times as expensive as unhealthy foods. And in 2019, so before the cost of living crisis, before the pandemic, the UK's poorest households needed to spend almost half of their disposable income in order to follow a healthy diet, which is in huge contrast to just 10% of disposable income required in the richest households. And of course, this has only got worse since then. And this is corroborated by this chart here, which is from the Fraser of Allender Institute report, which was published at the same time as ours, also funded by the Health Foundation. And what it's showing is the prevalence of food security in red, and then different degrees of food insecurity in the grey and yellow for different groups. And so I'm going to see if I can make... Yeah, here we go. So we can see that food insecurity is far higher in lowest income compared to highest income groups, unsurprisingly. It's higher in children compared to pensioners or compared to couples without children, and in particular really high in single parents, where almost 50% are food insecure. So these are no doubt underlying the trends that we're seeing in diet and those inequalities. So the fourth point that we draw out is that we're seeing the same worrying patterns of widening health inequalities in lots of different other outcomes. So the report focused, as I mentioned, on outcomes right across the life course. And these common trends to us indicate that there are common causes. So the top two graphs are examples of where we're seeing inequalities widening in other outcomes for children. So we've got infant mortality, and the proportion of children not immunised with MMR, the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, is going up in deprived areas. And then on the bottom two are just two examples of many that show how outcomes are also widening for adults. So avoidable mortality and, in particular, really exponential worrying increases in drug-related deaths occurring in more deprived areas. So this implies that there are some underlying forces at play here, probably linked to austerity. And then the differential susceptibility that we see in external shocks, so sort of environmental or societal shocks, such as we saw during the pandemic, also point towards the importance of these environmental causes. So this graph is taken from Public Health Scotland, and it's showing that during the pandemic, the prevalence of overweight and obesity in children shot up, but it shot up by a far higher degree in the most deprived groups. So they're less well equipped to deal with these environmental shocks. Obviously, this doesn't bode well for the cost of living crisis, where we'll probably start to see similar differential impacts. So collectively, what did we think that this told us? So our conclusion was that we need to look beyond the immediate inputs and outputs, so that includes health behaviours, to the wider social determinants of health. And I think that applies to the discussions that we're having today. So in the social determinants of health rainbow, which Marie Todd referred to, we've got things like health behaviours and parenting style in the lower layers. So these are the most proximal influences of health, and they no doubt are important, but they are in turn influenced by all of these things in the outer layers, so household resources, living and working conditions, the commercial determinants of health. So based on discussions already and the agenda for the rest of the day, I know I'm preaching to the converted, but I think it's really helpful to keep reminding ourselves of this. So acknowledging the importance of these is the first step, but we also need to keep ourselves in check and avoid something that's been called lifestyle drift. So this refers to what happens when, despite our best intentions to look at the outer layers of the rainbow, our focus unintentionally starts to drift downstream to individual health behaviours, because health behaviours are easier to measure, because they're easier to test in trials, and because they may feel easier to change, in contrast to the sort of engagement and cooperation that would be required, say, from powerful commercial actors such as industry in order to change those things in the higher levels. And so lifestyle drift occurs when it comes to policy making, setting targets, and in research as well. So we really need to work on the evidence base and think about how we can make a difference in those outer layers. So the factors shown in the red boxes here refer to things that are thought of as being downstream. It's not to say they're not important. Of course, they have a role to play. That alone, they're not very good at tackling health inequalities. In fact, there's evidence that they potentially can widen them. So what we want to strive for is something that looks a little bit more like this, potentially. So in addition to those more downstream things, we're looking towards environments of school and childcare, for example, food availability and access, advertising and pricing, and many of the things that we'll be covering today. So we need to push for that. But we also need to keep in mind the enormous influence of what's called the fundamental causes of health inequalities. And that's basically the distribution of power, money and resources in the population. And they influence everything that goes below that, as indicated by the black arrows. So changing those is hard, it takes time, and we don't always have the evidence that we'd like in order to think about how do we actually enact change. With that in mind, I wanted to finish on this slide, which is also from the Fraser of Allender Institute sister report. And what this graph is showing us is two things, I guess, I'd like to pull out. One is that children who are shown in this darker grey line are more likely to experience extreme poverty than other groups in the population, including pensioners here in the pale grey, and also that extreme poverty was increasing before the pandemic and is likely to be on the increase. Steps, including the Scottish child payment, are in the right direction. It's definitely a positive, but we need to keep pushing for more change like that if we're going to reduce childhood obesity, but also not leave some groups behind and inadvertently widen inequalities. So thank you for listening. I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this report, Naomi Mayel and Gillian Fergie, and then also the many other people that have contributed to this, and the Health Foundation for their funding. Thanks.
And thank you very much indeed. It's a good read, that report. I'm not saying all reports aren't a good read, but that was a especially good one. And welcome attention to the determinants of health, and holding this view on the whole population and what we might do. Questions arise though. Anyway, I want to move on to our third contributor of the first session, who's Anna Taylor, a very distinguished colleague, currently Executive Director of the Food Foundation, and that's been the case for almost 8 years. After 5 years with DFID, the Department of International Development, leading the policy team on nutrition. And that seems to be a major theme of her career so far, international efforts to recognise and address the global burden of undernutrition. She's worked also with Save the Children and UNICEF and other international organisations like that. UK Department of Health. She, in 2017, became a member of the London Food Board to advise the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority on food matters. A board member of Veg Power. Also, more recently, a chief independent advisor to Henry Dimbleby for the development of the National Food Strategy, which has been much in the news and was published in 2021. Anna has been recognised in the OBE for her efforts on the global burden of undernutrition, and we're very grateful to have her here talking to us this morning. Thank you.
Hello everyone, it's wonderful to be in Scotland. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. And we've had a really great set of presentations, and I have to say it was extremely heartening, I think, to hear such an enlightened presentation from the Minister earlier. I think down south we're all feeling rather demoralised at the moment, so it was very much a kind of fillip of inspiration for me. So thanks for the invitation to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit, very much builds on the presentations that we've had thus far. I'm going to particularly focus on the cost of living. And I should also say that quite a lot of the work that I'm going to be presenting today is delivered by my colleague Shona, who's in the room today and does amazing work on food insecurity in the team. So do talk to her afterwards if you'd like to find out more about what we're doing in this area. So I'm going to start first of all by talking about prices. Obviously, we're in a period of very rapid inflation. We've been tracking a basic basket of goods, so our basic basket tracker, if you want to try and find it on our website. This is a basket of goods that's purchased from Tesco, and it's within the broad parameters of the Eat Well Guide. It's not intended to be the cheapest way to eat the Eat Well Guide. It's a fairly kind of standard basket, though, and has enough fruit and veg and enough fibre and not too much HFSS, etc., etc. So we've been tracking it since the beginning of April 2022. So almost a year now, and you can see there how fast those prices have risen from the basket being about £41 a week to now being close to £50. So that's the reality for, you know, people's spending, absolute prices. And you can see here that what's been happening with food price inflation is that it's now overtaken average inflation. And is rising still quite steeply, starting to suggest that there's a slight plateauing, but at much higher rates of inflation in food categories than in other areas of the economy. So still a particular problem for families, and one that's not going to go away anytime soon. Then so that's the absolute costs. And then we've got the challenge of relative costs. This really goes back to Anna's last graph, lovely image where she showed the black lines of where the money is. Sort of keep your thought on that, sort of where is money in the system, because what I'm going to be talking about quite a lot is, you know, the price of food and affordability issues and why that traps so many families into eating badly. So this is also data from our broken plate report, which I think Anna referred to, or Lorraine, showing the relative costs per 1,000 calories of different food categories. Overall, when you group the HFSS, so the unhealthy food categories, and you compare them to all other categories, those calories are 3 times cheaper than other categories. So you've got this sort of gross imbalance, but this shows a bit more of a breakdown of the different categories. And on the bottom there, you see the cheapest source of calories are those core staples, bread, rice, pasta, and actually those are some of the categories that have really gone up the most during the inflationary periods. Confectionery actually is one of the categories that has gone up the least. So there's going to be some sort of turbulence in this graph when we produce it next in our broken plate report later this year. And then this goes back then to the point about affordability. So we said absolute price is a problem. Relative price is pointing people towards cheap, unhealthy calories. And then we've got the affordability challenge. This data was presented a slightly earlier set in the previous slide, really showing how much of your disposable income you'd need to spend in order to secure the Eat Well guide for different income quintiles, and the poorest families, the lowest income families, having to spend nearly half of their disposable income to secure that. So you've got affordability and price problems, and therefore it's kind of not surprising that now, in the context of the cost of living crisis, that we've seen such a massive, rapid escalation in food insecurity. So we've been tracking food insecurity now since the start of the pandemic, so April 2020, almost 3 years of data now. And this uses standardised approaches around households' experiences of being able to secure enough food to eat. This captures moderate and severe food insecurity. And you can see here that this is households with children data. There's all kinds of data cuts on our website. But you can see here we've seen a massive escalation during the cost of living crisis in food insecurity amongst households with children, now affecting about a quarter of households with children. And that equates to about 3.7 million children living in households where adults are saying they're either cutting back, skipping meals, not going for a whole day without eating, these kinds of conditions. And so what that really means then for parents is, I'm going to scoot through this slide first, is a really, really challenging set of questions which parents are facing when they're in that situation. Because it's not just the actual question of, have I got enough money to buy the food I need? But often those families are facing a multitude of other challenges which also impinge on those choices that they're able to make in the store. So it might be that they're worried about cooking and the cost of putting on the gas to be able to cook a meal. They're worried about, they haven't got a freezer, so they're worried about if things are going to go off. They don't want things that are going to be going to waste. They're also maybe thinking, well, I can't afford after school clubs, I can't afford sort of extra stuff for the kids that I really want to do with them. Eating together and cooking them something that they really enjoy is my way of being able to treat the children, you know. So there's that sort of other social dynamic which is really important. It's explained in some detail in this new policy briefing that we've published this week with City University. And then, of course, families are very worried about throwing stuff away, trying new things that might end up in the bin. And then going in with that set of anxieties, going into a food environment where all the things which are convenient, easy to prepare, tasty for the kids, tend to be the things which are then the least healthy. So that combination of that context in which families are living combined with a food environment which is doing harm. So we now have a situation, this is children's data in particular, in contrast to the adult data that I presented earlier. And this is where we are asking parents about whether food insecurity has affected children directly. And it's a slightly different set of questions, and we delve a bit more into quality of food. And again, you can see this huge jump in children's experiences of food insecurity over the past year overall, but then particularly around parents reporting them not having balanced meals, relying on low-cost food, skipping meals directly to the children, where parents are not able to protect their children to the extent that they would wish. So what do we do about it? So there's a set of, we can't give up is the key point, even though this feels like a very overwhelming challenge, and some of the issues, the presentations previously really point to this complexity of trying to deal with this. From obviously at its heart, and this reiterates many of the several other points that have been made this morning, is how we rebalance price, availability and appeal or marketing of food so that the healthiest choice is the easiest one. I think we need to have a laser sharp focus on price if we're concerned about really tackling those inequalities. That's where we can get the really big differences in terms of the issues which Anna presented. And to keep in mind that we've got two sides to this problem. We've got an income problem, which has to be dealt with, and we have a situation where if the food system makes it even harder for you if you've got an income problem. So we've got to make the food system do its bit. It's not going to be able to solve that income problem, which there are other policy levers for doing that. But we have to do everything we can to make the food system less damaging for those on a low income. So the key issue which we really want to see policymakers thinking about is what is that mix of fiscal measures that redress that balance of prices in the system, and what combination of taxes and subsidies will help to achieve that. Whether it's the sort of package that we proposed in the National Food Strategy around an extent, essentially a salt and sugar tax was what was proposed there, and using the revenue to fund the expansion of free school meals or Healthy Start, Best Start, other safety net measures which essentially subsidise good food for lower income families, or a different combination of taxes and subsidies. There are multiple other ways which you can try and get that seesaw effect. That's at the heart really of the challenging area of policy making at the moment that I think our leaders need to be really focused on. In the medium term, we've got some immediate opportunities which are coming up. We've got the Food Data Transparency Partnership, which is, I think, while extremely dry in its title, is potentially quite transformational in requiring food companies to report a set of sales-based data so that it reveals the extent to which corporate behaviour, those commercial determinants, whether they're moving in the right direction or not. And the disclosure of that data is going to be vitally important for all of us to hold them to account and for policymakers to be able to work out where they need to intervene next. And then, of course, the great work that's going on in Scotland around local food plans, because this kind of change on the national level is unbelievably slow, as we all know. But you can move faster in some of this, improving some of these food environments at a local level. And I think increasingly we're seeing the role of local authorities in doing what they can, pushing as far as they can on some of these issues around food environments. And then in the short term, we just launched 2 weeks ago, last week even in fact, our Kids Food Guarantee. This is a set of expectations of supermarkets. Right here and now, we're asking supermarkets to look at this list of actions and move towards trying to implement them. And we're going to be quite actively tracking which supermarkets are doing these things and which are not. So these are things that we feel, without government intervention, it's perfectly possible for supermarkets to do without them having a huge commercial, set of constraints. There's one specifically around fruit and veg, low-cost fruit and veg, and expanding the offers around fruit and veg to make sure that there's a variety, because often those fruit, the very cheap fruit and veg are often very narrowly targeted, and we're actually thinking, well, for £5 a day, you've got to eat a diversity of fruit and vegetables. Those offers need to be expanded. Thinking about staple foods, making sure if a supermarket is doing bog-offs, they're doing them on staple foods, not on HFSS. There's stuff in there on infant formula, making whole grain staples marginally cheaper than non-whole grain, and creating that little price incentive there for families. And thinking about some of the major kids categories, so particularly yogurts and breakfast cereals, and making sure that the cheapest items in those categories also have the lowest nutrient profile scores, so are the best for you and not the worst for you, because often It's the very cheapest yogurts that are the ones that are loaded with sugar, and similarly for breakfast cereals. So trying to switch that around. So we've just started, we've been having ongoing conversations with supermarkets about these. We're going to be tracking whether or not they're doing them. So would welcome your input and views into that process as we develop it. These are a couple of good examples where supermarkets are doing action in this area. Sainsbury's just launching a £2 fruit and veg box. Iceland promoting Best Start scheme on all of its milk bottles. This is one of our other actions. I didn't highlight it in the Kids Food Guarantee there, but we're asking the supermarkets to really promote Best Start and Healthy Start, because still so many families are missing out on those schemes. And then the other thing that I think we are certainly focusing on as a matter of urgency in the short term is around the income piece. I haven't presented the data here, but food insecurity levels are much, much higher amongst households who are in receipt of benefits. These are often working households, but they have universal credit that tops up their income. The government is gathering data which is showing the extent of food insecurity amongst this subsector of the population. The Work and Pensions, Department for Work and Pensions is responsible for for people who are in receipt of benefits. So we're really trying to push the Work and Pensions Committee at the moment to scrutinise a little bit more the adequacy of benefits for people to be able to afford a healthy diet, and also getting DWP to actually look at their data, own it a little bit more, and start to set some targets for reducing food insecurity amongst benefit claimants. That deals with the income piece of the problem, but we feel obviously that's a sort of vital part of the jigsaw puzzle here of trying to both change the food system and tackle the questions of affordability. That's it from me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. That was an excellent presentation. It actually brings us on from data and trends into actually what we're going to do about this. So can I invite the other two speakers, Lorraine and Anna, to join us on the platform? I've got an Anna problem, so just when the questions come in and I allot them, you'll know who you are. At least I hope you know who you are. Anyway, lots to interest us there. Questions, comments? Robin, down the front. Okay. Can we take your comment question down here?
Robin Ireland, Obesity Action Scotland. Thank you for some really excellent and stimulating presentations. Really, really useful and helpful, although worrying. I wanted, if I might ask, some of the work that Obesity Action Scotland has been alluded to before in terms of a whole systems approach to healthy weight. And you mentioned the role of local authorities, Anna, and it came up actually across that there's a tendency sometimes when we look only to government, and obviously the big fixes do come from either UK government or Scottish government. But I believe, and I think from what you were saying as well, there is a role that local authorities can play. And could you perhaps, if you're able to, talk a little bit more about that? Thanks.
What shall I have a go?
Your comments on local food plans.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I think certainly I feel like in the Food Foundation our thinking is evolving a little bit on this through some partnerships that we've got now. We've got a very close relationship with Birmingham City Council, which is obviously a big local authority that's really very committed to addressing some of these big issues around food environment, and we're quite quickly understanding, where are the limits, I suppose, of what they can do, but where they can actually do things which central government absolutely can't. And I think perhaps the really interesting area is around the more perhaps disruptive and alternative smaller scale manifestations of a better food system. So where you might not be able to, you know, intervene with controlling promotions or advertise, or you might, there's obviously some areas of advertising you can deal with as a local authority, but there's lots of things in a supermarket environment which you're quite limited in being able to do. But you can do quite a lot to think about, well, okay, if we kind of just forget about supermarkets, what space can we create for better forms of food supply and distribution, if you like, which might be grow in importance over time and be more challenging and disruptive to that sort of mega massive commercial sector in future, and testing some of those out. So connecting producers to consumers more directly, thinking about the ways in which we can use food to strengthen social well-being and connections with one another, with all the kind of knock-on impacts that has on health and well-being. So I think that's the really quite interesting and productive space, and obviously sustainable food places, all the brilliant work that's been going on across the country in that area comes to the fore at that point. And I'm excited to see what the Scottish local plans end up looking like. You guys are much closer to all of that than me, but
Lorraine,
it's quite
sort of
exciting.
an overview around the whole system approach pilots?
Yeah, I'll answer the question, Robin, but you'll know the answer I'm going to give, but it's for the benefit of the kind of wider audience. So, yeah, we've obviously been supporting the whole system approach, like the Minister said, that has had an early adopter phase where a number of areas tested that approach at local level. That was a partnership between local authorities and health boards. So we're now at the end of that early adopter phase, and we're in a phase that we're calling the kind of legacy phase before we move on to a national rollout. And I think we're very hopeful that out of that legacy phase there will be lots of really interesting learning, not just about the process, but about the actual interventions and actions and the things that we've learned through the early adopter phase of what this whole system approach can deliver. So there's going to be lots of outputs towards kind of May, June of this year that you can look out for that will capture the learning from that. And at the same time as we're learning from that early adopter phase, we are entering this phase of implementation of the Good Food Nation Act, which is where the local food plans are. And we will see the first stage of that will be the government introducing a national food plan and setting out what they want to cover within that. And hopefully that will be a very kind of holistic look at the food system, and it will cover everything from the health elements of the food system through to sustainability, waste, all these kind of issues. And then following on from that, there will then be a requirement for local food plans. And I think it's just about us grasping all those opportunities that exist and then turning them into things that can happen at local level, like Anna talks about, and things that we can then start to see change, but not ignoring the national change that needs to happen to support these things as well.
Thanks. Any other comments, questions? Yeah, the lady up there from Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Linda Morris, Greater Glasgow and Clyde again. Lorraine, you mentioned there the whole systems approaches, and I just think it's just important. We have a whole systems approach in Glasgow, and we've had it against 2 different projects at different times, but the one that's running just now. And it's just not to overlook the amount of investment and time that has to go into setting them up, and how much continued and sustained investment. And I don't mean money, resources, I mean time, in order to pull your system together. So, you know, and somebody has to be the anchor for that development of the system map and the asset map and all the other things, and then keeping your foot on the, it takes quite a lot to do that. And I think that's just, it's really important that when you look at a long-term plan, that when you start thinking about whole systems, you have that uppermost in your mind, is how long it will take just to establish and get your system, you know, cooking the gas, really, basically. And while I'm on the cooking the gas, it's just that thing about, I love the Food Foundation stuff. I use it all the time in the work that I do. And it's just that thing about we, through our community food networks and the work that we've got with community food alongside our whole system approach, which is to alleviate food insecurity, it's predicated on that. We come across families all the time where, although the healthier foods are 3 times more expensive and we can put things in place like sugar taxes and other, the reality is that even if they buy them or get them given to them free or at very low cost through pantries and flat pack meals, they can't afford to cook them. These healthier foods are raw, they require to be cooked. When you put out recipe books or any aids to help cook alongs or anything with families, they'll say, but I can't put the gas on for 2 hours to cook the chicken. I've got to have which leads us down the road of ultra-processed foods. And I think that's another issue that's coming up in terms of creating a lot of problems, and actually there's just a bit of unintended consequence there that I think if we're not mindful of it ahead of the game, then the unintended consequence comes out to bite us further down. And whilst I absolutely commend sugar tax, the unintended consequence of that is that sometimes some children, those sugars that are those foods that are at the bottom end there around the sugary syrup might be the only calories that poor children are getting in a day. And when we've been doing summer food provision in Glasgow City, we've had to be very mindful of that, of not vilifying anything because it might be the only calories some children get.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, it depends what you define as whole system, but whole system includes the cost of energy. Any other comments, questions? Yes, one, and then the lady behind you.
Thank you. I was really intrigued by the work that you're doing in the Food Foundation, Anna, about voluntary measures for supermarkets and retailers to sign up to. We heard the Minister say earlier on how difficult it is to create interventions with retailers and commercial organisations during the tough times. How much traction are you getting with that work? Has that work worked during the easy times? You know, you could argue we've had 10 years of times when food has been cheap or cheaper relative to a lot of places in Europe. There's been much wider choice and more food security. Are you seeing things change now because the external sort of fiscal environment's changing around us? How's it going?
Thanks. It's a good question, and I think it's too early to say for the Kids Food Guarantee. It's literally a week or so old. I think what we found during the pandemic, and obviously supermarkets were doing pretty well during the pandemic, so this perhaps isn't such a good comparator, but we did find we put a lot of energy into getting the supermarkets to add value to the Healthy Start and Best Start scheme by putting in extra. This is when we had paper vouchers, not the digital card, which has made it harder, but to add value to those schemes. And we made a lot of progress, again, just entirely voluntary, because there was the time frames meant there was absolutely no. Obviously, we primarily think mandatory levers are the most important ones. We're trying to be really pragmatic and just get on and see how far we can push supermarkets here and now to do things that need to be done, because we know that nobody else is going to be pushing them at this point in government. So I think we've had some good progress, and through our Peas Please programme, we've learned a fair amount about how. Where you can push supermarkets and where you hit up against some of those commercial constraints. I think it'll be interesting to see. We're embarking into a partnership with Question Mark, who are going to be our sort of data partners on this, which will allow us to really get a sense of whether. I think for some of these areas, some supermarkets are doing them already, so that again gives us quite a hope that these are achievable by multiple supermarkets, and we'll create some of that leverage. And we're thinking quite creatively on the comms side about how we can get the results to consumers. I mean, we're not an organisation that speaks to consumers directly, we speak to government and businesses, but we're partnering up with some people who have a bigger voice with consumers. That's all sort of in the pipeline. So that actually they will be able to see, oh, look, if I go to Lidl, I'm guaranteed that the cheapest cereals are going to be the best ones for my kids, or whatever, that, like, where we're actually pushing out those examples to create some of that pressure through that route, because obviously that's probably much more important than us just talking to them directly. So we're trying a few different strategies. We'll let you know whether or not it's successful. Too early to tell at this point, but we're going to give it a go.
I'm afraid time is against us. I know there's a number of people wanted to ask a question, but I think we'll have to break pretty soon. Can I just ask one final quick question to Anna Pearce, which is a lot of talk about bits of the population in particular distress, and your report really focuses on the bottom 20%. You're splitting the population often into fifths. And the best off children doing quite well, and I'm not very worried about them, but I'm very worried about the particularly challenged children and people from very challenged communities. Should this alter our approach to whole population, to what I'm hearing is quite a lot of discussion about children in particular trouble?
So I guess I'm interpreting your question, Andrew, is do we need a more targeted approach? And there's value in it. Proportionate universalism is a term that's thrown around a lot, particularly with respect to health inequalities. So this idea that you have universal interventions, but you also give additional support to those groups that need it. And I think that is the way forward. And in the report, we show that things are getting particularly bad in that bottom quintile. So there is a social gradient, and so people who live in the second least deprived still have worse health than those in the least deprived. And so we need to keep an eye on that. Those really deprived groups need more help. One challenge is, how do we identify them? So 50% of income poor families don't live in deprived areas. In that report, we focused on the Scottish Index Multiple Deprivation, just because it's the most easily measured sort of proxy that we have. And so I think that remains a challenge, is actually knowing who are the groups that require additional support. Can we reach them, and can we do that in a way that's not stigmatising as well? So I don't think I've offered a solution, just highlighting more challenges, but yeah, it's a difficult one.
But it starts to unpack what we're going to go on to in this next section is remedies, and we've already started this, think about what we're going to do about what we hear and what the data and the trends are, but that's for part 2. Time slipped a bit. There's tea and coffee outside. You're very welcome to take that and have a chat, but can you come back here quite promptly? We're due to start at 5:02, and we've got 4 speakers and a bit of chat to take us up to the end of the meeting. So come back as soon as you can. Thanks very much indeed.